Hello and welcome everyone. It is Thursday, July 8th, and welcome to today's session of Let's Talk AWS. I'm Aaron Ansari with Trend Micro, and with me we have Merritt Baer. Thank you everyone for being here. A couple of show notes and a couple of reminders. Make certain that you're following along with us on the various social media platforms by way of which you're watching this. And you can use those social media platforms to enter comments, have questions, talk to us in the show, as well as, enter running commentary as we're going along. We'll also be able to answer those questions live as we're going through today's session and today's seminar. So be certain to be active and participating in this. Before we get started and introducing Merritt, I'd like to thank the team that kind of made this possible. First of all, AWS and Trend Micro, thank you so much for making this platform and this service available to our audience, as well as everyone involved here. Thanks Ingrid, Joy, Caitlin, Amanda, Lindsay, Whitney, great job team for setting this up and kind of getting it set up. I know Merritt and I were in the green room before kind of talking about how well the social media team here at Trend did to make this event happen and possible. So thanks so much. Without further ado, though, I want to introduce our guest today, Merritt Baer. Merritt, I was trying to go through and put together a little bit of a bio on you, and I think I ran out of space on my notepad because I got to Harvard Law, DHS, FCC, adjunct professor, AWS, like just all the stuff that I was going through and trying to put together on you. So I figured the best way to introduce you would actually be let you to introduce yourself. So Merritt, thank you for being here and thanks for being a part of this.
Well, thank you. I got to hire you as my hype guy from now on. Can you come over when I'm feeling tired? No, I'm happy to be here, and thanks folks for tuning in. So that you're aware, folks who are listening, we have Q&A open, so please put your questions in. Take advantage of the fact that we're live here. We are real humans. As mentioned, my name is Merritt Baer. I'm coming in from Miami, so I'm on Tequesta, Miccosukee, and Creek land. I am a principal in the office of the CISO at AWS. And in that role, I split my time between a lot of interesting stuff, but mostly between two things: trying to help AWS get better at our own security, as we obviously run on AWS, and then also helping customers and having CISO to CISO conversations. So if someone says, my CISO wants to talk to your CISO, they often get me. And so that's interesting too, because I get to empathize as someone who does security and as someone who hears patterns across the security landscape. As you mentioned, I have a background with a law degree, and then in DC for 10 years before I moved to Miami. I have worked in all three branches of US government doing security on behalf of the American people.
Fantastic. Yeah. And I think you might be underplaying yourself with just a law degree. Coming from an Ivy League Harvard education background, the work that you've done both at AWS and before is truly fantastic. And of course, the work that you did for the US citizens and via all three branches is fantastic. And I'm sure brings great perspective in the discussions that you're having with AWS customers, as well as just people around the industry.
Well, thank you. My proudest moment was getting HTTPS across the .gov, but that's a story for another day.
That's a huge, the work there.
2014, but wow. Again,
excellent.
Sometimes there are hills worth dying on, as they say. So
absolutely, and I'm sure that's a whole other show that we could do. Excellent. So today's topic, what we're going at today is security being job zero. And one of the things that, as we were putting together the agenda for this show, and we had, a lot of work actually goes into putting together a live show. It's quite fascinating how much effort and how much content gets written and discussed before an hour live program happens. But as we were going through and building out the agenda and talking about the discussion points for security being job zero, we had a lot of I guess tangential discussions on kind of what it means. One, for security being everyone's job, and two, if it should be everyone's job at organizations. So when you're having your discussions and talking to your CISO peers and or customers, and even at AWS, how does that translate? What does security being job zero actually mean? And how does it, the second follow-up question would be, how does it translate to the customers and the people with whom you're having your daily discussions with?
Yeah, it's interesting because we are not a company that does a lot of marketing. I mean, we don't get out there and do fancy spiels, but it's interesting that security being job zero has become one of the terms that we have sort of become associated with. And I think it is not a pure marketing term. Like, it is a genuine philosophy, which is that there is a sea change. Now that cloud is here, first of all, the decision not to move to cloud is an affirmative decision. Like, you don't exempt yourself by not moving. You're choosing to stay in whatever environment you're in, and you have a risk posture and a security posture that you are literally and metaphorically paying for. But beyond that, the move to cloud is reflective of this broader sea change, that security is not something you bolt on after the fact, that security teams are not gatekeepers, that you don't have a guy who's like hugging his servers in the corner and asking, and you say, may I, that it must be democratized down, that it must be woven into the dev cycles. And, there are terms that no one loves, but no one has a better version of, like DevSecOps. But really what it means is, like, now that we're interacting with infrastructure as code, we have security as code. And in a sense, that's a luxury, right? You no longer have to worry about the rogue server under someone's desk. You have programmatic ability to get visibility, to get configuration drift awareness, and to automatically remediate that. So in AWS, for example, that's config and config rules. Config rules under the hood is a Lambda function, which is what all of the remediative controls are. So CloudWatch events, custom Lambdas that you might write, and so on and so forth. And I think this is really like a fundamental shift in how your organization will relate to each other, because you no longer get to like put your security team over here and say, like, look at it when we're done. That's just not how we want to work. Right. And it's not efficient. And so, we're moving from Waterfall to Agile. We're weaving it in, and we're doing, a mix of fine-grained permissions as well as perimeter-centric permissions.
Which is just mind-boggling in a couple of ways based on what you said. One, just a few seconds ago, you said we're moving from, Waterfall to Agile. And I can remember in 2006 having a very similar discussion about moving from Waterfall to Agile, right? And so to still hear that organizations are doing this migration, which they are, you're 100% right. We have within our customer base, we still might have those server admins kind of clinging over in the corner of the data center, holding onto their servers every once in a while. But it points to two things. One, it's not just this point in time thing where it's just happening across every organization. And then two, I would imagine that within your customer base and within discussions that you're having, it might be even verticalized, right? Like a healthcare organization might be a little bit more hesitant than a technology organization, or a financial services company might be a little bit behind in their digital transformation versus, some other organization. Are you seeing that sort of industry-specific migration happening across your customer base?
Yes and no. So to answer your immediate question, I think there are some trends across a lot of customer bases. And frankly, I see trends also happening. I just realized I'm punning because we're on Trend Micro.
We're Trend Micro, right? But we love it. So keep it up. Trend.
I see trends also across like what's happening in the world, right? So when COVID happened, then everyone is kind of saying, oh my gosh, we never thought we could work from home. And I'm thinking, so you weren't doing like agnostic permission, like you should be. I mean, grow up, right? It really shouldn't be that different. Like, of course, there are certain perimeters that are helpful to integrate into your signal to noise, to filter out unnecessary noise. But, and so it's not to say that you shouldn't use perimeters, but like a VPN or a VPC, like, why wouldn't that be relevant for your remote employees just as much as it is for your folks in your physical offices? And I think this has been sort of a growing up over the past year where folks get more comfortable with abstracted notions of perimeters, because we no longer have the luxury of telling ourselves that physical perimeters are where it starts and ends. And I think that's healthy. And it's certainly good for folks who have disabilities or who need to work from home because of family obligations and other things that we have long, kind of lamented that the industry might not be welcoming to. So I think, that's one thing. But yeah, I think there's certainly industry specific considerations. If you think about, agriculture, for example, there's a lot of IoT sensors that are out there. Well, now you're thinking about how to embed security into IoT sensors. We could do a whole other thing on green grass, but like raising the water level when it comes to the kinds of interactions that you're doing. Another example is PCI, right? Who isn't interacting with money in some sense? And we have an interesting tool called Tiros that, so I'm a girl of our automated reasoning group, ARG, and they do formal methods. So automated reasoning, bunch of math PhDs, because now you're doing infrastructure as code, you can do security as code, you can reason about the security of your networks. So we have a tool called Tiros that they helped to build. It's now part of Inspector, which is one of our services, and it does network reachability. So it can reason about the reachability of your networks without sending a single packet over the network. So this is hugely helpful for folks who are impacted by PCI. You can reason about whether you have an internet-facing endpoint, which is one of their data, and that will show up in Security Hub as a green, yellow, or red light for you. So, anyway, there's ways that you can take advantage of that and leverage it. And I think, you're right. There are certain industry particularities depending on, what your business is. But ultimately, I think what we're really seeing is, and I think it's healthy, is like a recognition that security is a business enabler and is a business differentiator. And every time, just as a consumer, we get a note that says, we take your security seriously, and they're about to notify you of something they did wrong.
Right.
It offends our senses, and it should. Like, we should be, we are not perfect. Like you said, this is just a process, and we are human and fallible. And that's in some ways why I think the security industry is so interesting to work in. But it's also, one of the things that I think companies are increasingly realizing, this is a way to build trust. This is not a cost center. This is core to our business. Right. And that comes back to the job zero.
Absolutely. And to that end, one of the patterns, I won't use the word trend just because, but one of the patterns that we are seeing within our customer base is kind of this business information security officer or business information risk officer position coming to fruition across organizations. So not only, as you mentioned, is it just this central team or this core team of security, but it's almost security as a service layer across every vertical within an organization. And some organizations are even getting to the point where they're hiring business information risk officers and business information security officers that are specific to that company's business unit. And then tie that person back to the core information security group or team across the organization, which truly is showcasing that security is everyone's job, and that they're acknowledging exactly what you said, the fact that it's not a cost or an overhead or a line item in a budget anymore. It's truly part of the business risk and some of the business operational cost that has to happen with with transacting today.
I see that happening too, although I think one of the keys here is how your organization is structured. So if you have a business risk officer who has no teeth, for lack of a better word, then they are a cost center, right? It's got to be informing the business, and not just as a cautionary tale. Like, this needs to be core to understanding why and how you do what you do, and enabling the business and enabling your customers, and sticking up for the right thing when you think that you are right. But also, when I was a civil servant, so since we brought up government service, I considered my job as a civil servant, in part, one of the reasons that you are not a political is that you are genuinely supposed to give your opinion, and then leadership makes a call. Right. But you don't water it down. You don't give them what they want to hear. And I think in the same vein, it's not helpful if we have this new role that is, trying to couch things or or alternatively is, taking a stand when it's not the direction the business is going. And I think, I don't personally believe in balance because I consider myself 100% of more than one thing. But I do think that there is this like really healthy tension that we have in companies where they are figuring it out and where they know it's going to be a process. And anyone who says, we've just got it, our security is done, we'll see you next year, be concerned,
Absolutely.
This is it's a human level endeavor, which is another reason why we need diverse people who think differently, who may not have gone to a CS program, who may not have gone to college at all, who may not be, the typical whatever. Like, we need folks who think differently and approach problems differently. And, we know because technologies are built by humans that they are imperfect. And so to secure them will also take work and it will be imperfect. And I think that is where we sit here as a secure, at least for me, like one of the reasons to do this role is because I think I can make the world a little bit better. And the way to do that is sort of like there's no other end except through, or whatever that phrase is,
right.
You go and you do when you start somewhere.
Absolutely you do. And that philosophy, or at least that keep using the word now I'm stuck with it.
Now
trend,
hashtag.
Right, now we've got a hashtag it, right? That philosophy is certainly something that I think we're at the kind of beginning end of the pendulum to see that.
Trend Micro team, we're starting a new hashtag. It's called Trend Micro.
Trend meta.
Like, is that redundant? No, we're doing it.
We're doing it. It's done. Start trending it now. Oh, there we go. You just can't get behind it. So Merritt, one of the things that you touched on, and if you're playing buzzword bingo at home, you can't have a webinar or some sort of discussion without it, was sort of the digital transformation that's been caused as part of the pandemic, right, or the shutdown. Now that we're kind of, at least the United States is kind of on the exit of this shutdown in various places. Trend has seen a huge, in some of our estimates, it's 700+% adoption of cloud technologies, cloud applications, just a shift in the way that business is done by way of not doing things in a traditional data center and not doing things on-prem, simply because organizations had to, as you alluded to. At AWS, kind of are obviously, hopefully, you're seeing something similar. But what has sort of been the reaction now that we're on the kind of decline of the shutdown, and sort of this huge adoption, or this almost data skewing shift that hit the United States businesses and in general over a year ago? What are you seeing, and what are you seeing as part of sort of that business operation model now?
Yeah, well, certainly, as you point out, I think it's not a matter of if enterprises will move to the cloud, it's a matter of when.
Right.
But that being said, my role is in part to empathize with folks, to say, like, we are no city on a hill. We work on this, we have, for example, in our security shop, we have a policy of, lowercase p policy, not the term of, not the Amazonian term, but
right.
We have a policy of never closing a trouble ticket until you've scripted a remediation. So that means that we joke that we hire lazy security engineers, because we want folks who want to automate everything away and never solve the same problem twice. I think, that's a philosophical belief that you can also ingrain into your operations. So the belief that good intentions are not good enough, you have to mechanize it, find ways to incorporate this into how you do your security and grow up your security shop. That being said, like I said, empathy. Most enterprises, of course, not all, we have, kind of lighthouse made in cloud. And we also have small, fairly recent folks who, of course, are building on cloud because they don't have the external infrastructure. But most enterprises in that middle gray area have some assets on-prem as well as in the cloud. And I think there are challenges with that. You've got to figure out how to get your visibility. You've got to figure out your connections. There's a lot of finding the ways to couple those larger order, the ways that you can programmatically solve things and put an API behind it. And then also figure out how to reduce your manual lift on the stuff that is on-prem still, and how to migrate safely, and how to figure out how to get true visibility. And I think that is just an ongoing struggle. And I empathize, but I think that folks, especially through the pandemic, are noticing the returns. As I mentioned, folks are, for the most part, fully remote. The returns in being able to get that visibility and that config drift, not just visibility, but even auto remediation.
Sure. And, I think AWS does a great job in particular, and we certainly harp on this with our customers and prospects of, the shared responsibility model as well as the well-architected framework, right? Having these standards in place that companies that are doing this migration are able to adhere to and at least map towards, I think behooves the organization with tens of thousands, if not millions of dollars in savings to take the lessons learned that you've seen on a million X times over, put them in this well-architected framework and giving that to your customers to be able to say, hey, we've seen this, we know what you're about to go through, take these 5 pillars, maybe even more so from an advice standpoint and do these things, and you're going to have a much better experience, right?
Aaron, you're still being my hype guy, and I love it. No, I guess you're right. Like, we try to give tools to customers. So as you mentioned, I think we should probably just kind of level set here. So shared responsibility model kind of refers to the value proposition of cloud as a whole, right? So sure. We're talking about, for folks who are not familiar, we're talking about that basic proposition that AWS or whatever cloud provider takes care of those bottom layers of the stack. So generally, it's the concrete floor and the guards and the gates and so forth, right, up to layer 4, the hypervisor, or in Nitro's case, no hypervisor. Whoop, whoop. And then the customers maintain the security of and configurations of those top layers of the stack, layer 4 through 7 software layers. And that is not because we are lazy or are abdicating, responsibility. It's because only you know what you're doing. We have a business proposition, which is that we don't look at your data, encrypt everything, we do not, as a platform, want to see content, and that is not how we operate. So I think there is this core kind of understanding that comes from that. Well, one, you get some security inheritances, not like really significant ones, from the fact that we do those data centers and we're doing them at scale. And I'm actually even going to talk reinforce our security conference about some of these inheritances, because I think since folks don't need to toggle them, they don't think about them. But everything from, like I mentioned, our Nitro hardware, which is our custom hardware that has inherent security benefits, as well as availability and other compute beauties. And that underpins all of EC2, which is our basic compute model, to, the way that we put in place policies, again, lowercase p, like no piece of hardware leaves a data center intact, from region build goals to how we decide that there's enough power and enough connectivity and it's not built in the floodplain. There's just a lot of security inherent to the extent that you include availability and your definition of security, which is the CIA, it's the A in CIA. Right. These are like really lovely things to not have to worry about. And it's a business differentiator for you as a CISO to not have to babysit your servers and not have to worry about the guards and the gates. So anyway, that is a little bit of background, but I think as we lead into these conversations about, to configure those higher, levels of the stack, I totally get that it is a work, it is a work effort.
Right.
Depends on what you're doing with it, right? And right. Wish we could make it so that there are never any issues for our customers. Like I'm not a salesperson. I'm extremely invested in our customers not having a bad day. My only job is to make our security better. And I think that it frees me up to think about how to make the secure thing the easiest thing to do, not just for our employees and, internal customers, but for every customer on AWS.
And I wholeheartedly agree. And I know that that's a pervasive theme among every AWS employee. But the difference is you certainly see it when you start giving features and frameworks away to help your customers do that migration.
I hope so. I think that, so for example, like, we have tried to take some things on our side. So, S3 block public access is now something you can do programmatically through your entire organization, because we noticed this was a pain point. Like, there should be things that if we can take it off your plate, we want to. So right. Also, this is a call that if you have ideas, feel free to reach out to me personally or to AWS support. Like, we are always building and figuring out the next right thing to do. But some of this is, getting folks comfortable with how security looks in cloud. So, your web server gets popped, you kill and spin up a new one, you haven't solved your problem. No. Getting to ephemeral architectures is one thing, but there's also like the beauty of immutable architectures. And there's also, the freedom to revert to a known good state with no cost, and with, the freedom of being able to see it codified literally in code. So golden armies and CloudFormation templates, and the ability to vend accounts with a templatized IAM permission. And there's a lot of ways that we try to create scale.
Very much so, and potentially have it out there forever by way of the permanence that you can build into the services that you use, and whether or not it be ephemeral, pervades those services across your various architecture.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. There's like this mix of immutability and ephemeral.
Right.
That actually, it couples, and that's the foundation, right? The idea that you can kill one architecture and then spin up a new one that is in the mold of what you already have defined. There's just a sweetness there.
Very much so. So as we've been talking, we've had some questions come in across our various channels. Thank you, everyone, for those questions. One of the beauties of a discussion like this, as Merritt just mentioned, is the AWS, Merritt herself, takes these ideas and wants to make things from it. One of the beauties of a session like this is that you get direct access to talk to Merritt and that brain trust instantly. So Billy Hightower on YouTube asked a question, and this is actually a topic that we were going to go to later on in the show. So I think this is a great segue. But if you're playing buzzword bingo at home, here we go. With the recent visibility of ransomware attacks via software supply chain, Kaseya, SolarWinds, have your conversations changed with your customers based on those recent events? So, for those who may not be familiar with what's happening, or like me, have been living on a mountain for 24 days and just got back, there have been some very, very in the news or at least, forward ransomware attacks that have popped up via Revel, via whomever you'd like to attribute them to. The most recent one being Kaseya. The one prior to me living on a rock, not under a rock, was SolarWinds. So with those, kind of on the forefront, on the news, on the front page of everyone's phone, how are your conversations and your discussions going there?
I think it's Revel, isn't it? Because I assumed it was evil.
Yeah, like I said, I've literally been on a rock for 24 days. Right.
So a couple thoughts there. I think one, ransomware is nothing new, right? We've seen this since at least the 70s. It's just that with the invention, it's a form of malware.
Sure.
With the invention, and malware is as old as the internet, which, depending on who you ask, goes back to VintSerf or other people or DARPA or whatever. Right. But for as long as the internet has been around, we've seen malware, and things like the Morris worm, we're not even intentionally evil and yet enacted a lot of damage. So ransomware is one that generally is done by criminal groups because they are asking for a payout, although sometimes nation states seem to be behind these. And I think it's not a coincidence that we see them, but at the same time, like, this is nothing unknowable. I mean, they're not using 0 days. These are all knowable things that we can protect against. And frankly, if you're eating your vegetables, then I'm not like victim blaming, but like, then you're doing the right stuff. That's how you protect against ransomware. Right. So it looks different on-prem. On-prem, the vast majority are in unpatched Windows servers. So a lot of times it actually has been an enabler. I am not one to ambulance chase, but it has been an enabler for cloud that folks who have on-prem assets that they say, like, don't touch that. We don't know what it's connected to. We haven't patched it in 40 years. Should now have a bit of a wake up call or whatever, or maybe just like the impetus that they needed to take it to the board and say, let's move. Really, I believe in security teams. I think they are trying to do the right thing, and they are often constrained by what the business structures them as and gives them a budget for, and so on, and imagines their job to be. In cloud, it's essentially credential compromise, right? I mean, you're talking about the same kinds of considerations that you would give to other concerns. So, like I said, eat your vegetables. I'm actually doing a talk about this as well at Reinforce, but it goes through least privilege, which again is easier said than done. Like, this is a journey, but start with a single step. I'm like full of cliches today for some reason. But anyway, doing things, and of course with cloud you can reason about your permissions. So again, being an ARC fangirl, there's a tool called Zelkova. Now is a contributor to Access Analyzer that can tell you authoritatively, which I am, so identity and access management policy is more permissive than another, and can also find escalation paths and can identify for you permissions that haven't been used lately so that you can shave them down, those kinds of things. And then meanwhile, blast radius, right? So don't give the keys to the kingdom to everyone who's employed by you. You want to scope your permissions on your resources and your humans. You want to have visibility. You want to, so enable CloudTrail, which logs every API call. Now that everything is an API call, has an API call. Cloud Watch, which logs things like CPU usage, like looking at anomalous activity. And then the services that we built on top of those. So things like Trend and things like Guard Duty and, the ability
config.
Visibility and to work with it, like distinguish signal from noise and then determine actions upon that. And I think, like I said, easier said than done, right? But in some ways, like what I just described sounds a lot like zero trust, because that is what you're thinking of, is how to reduce. I don't think of zero trust as being like, oh, let's create something like a piece of paper that can't connect to anything. Like, what are you going to do with that?
Right.
Zero trust. Well, great. It solves nothing for me. What you really want are a combination of those perimeter-based controls that filter out noise, and then those fine-grained identity-centric permissions. So think something like, so those are things like security groups and ACLs. And so an example of something that's not only aware of, but augmenting one another in that, it would be like a VPC endpoint policy. So, but these are inherently cloudy ways of thinking about how to scope down your blast radius and your permissions.
Very, very interesting. So far, of the services that you've discussed, config, Guard Duty, Macy, CloudWatch, CloudTrail logs, all those sorts of things. I've been pretty good, and I've been aware of all those. But you just mentioned something that I'd never heard of, and we're going to digress a little just because personally I'm interested in this, and that was Zelkova. Was it Zelkova?
Yeah, so it's a tool that is within Access Analyzer and a few others of our identity suite. Identity and security are so closely aligned that we overlap a lot, and a lot of security could be mediated through good use of identity. But yeah, so Zelkova is the ability to reason about one identity policy and another, and to authoritatively say which one is more permissive and if there are escalation paths. So it's kind of interesting. This, in my mind, goes back to Ada Lovelace, who is Lord Byron's daughter. She's a poet's daughter, and I think that's not a coincidence. She's one of the founders of, I was going to say modern computing, but I hate that because there's like a modern and a postmodern period.
Right.
But of current computing, right?
Yeah.
One of her insights was that computers could do higher level reasoning. And what we're really talking about is, what are computers good at and what are humans good at? Computers will never like make a leap of faith or an innovative insight, and we don't really know how like neurons work, but humans are.
Sure.
We get to, sometimes we wake up and we have put pieces together in novel ways. I mean, imagine like the landscape that we were working on, that like a group of folks put together the internet. Like, how incredible, right? But she was one of those who was very insightful about the idea that we could reason at a higher order about the use of computers. And I think of that in terms of two things. One is, computers are good at some stuff and humans are good at some stuff. And they're not actually that similar. Like, computers are good at being right all the time about the stuff that you tell them to do. Humans are good at making leaps and at, like creating new things, and we are therefore imperfect, but computers will always sort of get it right. So the Automated Reasoning Group and Zelkova kind of tried to play on that. So if you can scope a problem down, because otherwise the logic would run forever. But if you can scope it down to something that is solvable, then the logic is that you can get an answer. And so this is kind of the premise of the entire group in terms of formal methods. I mean, Apple uses this for their secure enclave. Like, we are not the only ones, but this is a really interesting area that became available because we're doing higher level computing. Because like, if you think about it, when you get into higher level math, all the numbers turn into letters, right?
Right. Variables and yeah.
There's like a beauty there and an elegance, and computers can be good at that, but humans will always be the ones to initiate new commands. And the other side of that is the stuff that will always be reserved for human insight. Like, we need innovation, but we also need judgment calls. Like, a lot of my job is making good judgment.
Yeah. And it sounds like, and, given your background, especially going through thinking the way that a lawyer thinks, making good judgment is a great foundation for you to do the roles and the things that you're doing now.
Maybe. I don't know. I think lawyers are often either too business. I don't think that lawyers should always disguise their legal advice as business advice, but I do think that having a law degree helps to debunk the mystery that that the law is an immutable thing. Like, we create laws too, right? I mean, they're not perfect, and these are moving constructions. And again, this is why the water is warm. And for those who are listening who are interested in law or security, you are constructing that landscape by participating in it. And that's exciting.
Very much so. Very much so. You actually wandered into the next topic of our discussion when you started talking about the Automated Reasoning Group and some of the innovative things that humans are coming up on. And that's kind of what's next in cyber, right? Terminologies, things have been tossed around with artificial intelligence and machine learning. Blockchain, NFTs, more ransomware, which, as you alluded to, is something that's been around since the 70s and 80s, or the genesis of the internet. But what are you seeing, and what are you thinking, either both personally, professionally, kind of, and what you're responding to in the industry about kind of what's next, right? What as you're getting ready for your Reinforce discussion, which I'll be at, by the way, so I'd love to come to your session and listen to what you're going to be talking about there. But what are you seeing? What are you thinking? What's next when your customers ask you that question?
So I'll answer your question and then dig into like a side note, which is what I think junior folks should get invested in if they're looking at the field. Yeah. So to answer your question, what I see perennially is just challenges of scale. So folks are trying to figure out how to do identity at scale, how to do visibility, how to be focused on how do I know I'm focused on the right stuff? And, whether it is API calls, whether it is the size of your data lake, we're pushing not necessarily AWS's boundaries, although sometimes we do have service limits. And, if you run into those, write to me because we'll figure out if we can
right.
Right. Some of these are just engineering realities and some are things that we can, work on. But we are getting to a point where we've unleashed this entire environment in a way that folks are pushing the boundaries. And I think it's awesome. And by folks, I mean also us, right? We push at how much we data, one of the talks that I give starts with a slide that says, if you could have all of the data in the world and could do unlimited analytics on top of it, obviously I'm an engineer, so I know unlimited is not a thing, but let's say you could, because it feels like that, right? So what would you do differently? What data would change your business and what knowledge and what insights? And frankly, sophisticated shops are doing analytics on their analytics and they're doing, security data lakes and then pulling out even unsophisticated shops. I noticed what are you doing with your last, and by that, I just mean folks who may not even have a security team, but I would say what are you doing with your last month of trouble tickets? What patterns are you drawing?
Right.
Friends. How are you learning from what you're doing? How are you growing up? And I think that, now that cloud has unleashed this so that folks are freed up to do a lot of that and even heavy compute, right? Bracket is our quantum computing as a managed service. You don't have to keep it in sub-zero temperatures in a vacuum. You get to just interact with quantum compute hardware. That's fascinating. And you can do high compute in fractions of seconds. And we've seen pharma, for example, be able to do trials in hours instead of, months or longer because they can run the data. Okay, but that almost feels paralyzing. How do we do this right? And I think those are most of the questions that I get are here's our situation, here's what we're trying to do. And we just haven't figured out how to wrap our heads around it and solve this, from a business perspective. They're getting gains, even a lift and shift where you're just moving from your data centers over and just using it on AWS. At least you can switch what region you're in by just going up to the top of the console and you can, you can spin stuff up and spin it down and there's still advantages. But I think once you really kind of lean into cloud centric, then there's a lot of interesting stuff to dig through. And those are the conversations that I primarily have with customers. But for folks who are listening, who are early career and are thinking how do I know what to focus on? I think obviously serverless is huge. So Lambda, for example, is the one that I mentioned earlier is our
Lambda functions. Yeah.
Yep, under the hood. So you can write custom Lambda functions, but it's also what powers CloudWatch events and config rules and so on and so forth. Containers, in part because, as I mentioned, most folks are working between environments. And so they are, modular. It is, I think, introducing some degrees of complexity, but it also can have billing advantages and so on and so forth. I would say thinking through aspects of security that you're interested in. It's a big element. I think that there would be really interesting work to do in doing sort of continuous compliance, so compliance as code, and then also thinking through code pipelines and how to integrate security into how you push to production. So I swear that I did not plan this to be a pitch for my reInvent talks or reinforce talks, but my third talk there is on how to do incident response as you move through the pipeline to production. So from pre-prod to prod. On the one hand, empathizing with the fact that in production, everything ends up being a little bit different. Sure. But then on the other hand, taking advantage of the dexterity of cloud and the idea that you can have, sandboxing and test environments. And you can also, even before you put in your test environment, you can reason about what your controls are and how to guardrail effectively. And then your incident response never needs to become an incident if it's pre-prod.
Very well said. And 3 talks. You're going to be busy, but
yeah,
Yeah. So very well said. And that kind of gets us to our last topic. I think we've got about 15 minutes left for today's session. And you segued well into sort of the development component of things. So you're talking about the life cycle promotion of environment from pre-production or development to test to pre-prod to prod. It's DevOps, DevSecOps, however you want to say it, that's kind of doing that. And we started out this discussion by talking about security being job zero, and it's no secret that what we're talking about as we're building out architectures comes from site reliability engineers, architects, and developers, full stack developers, right? And so with security being job zero and security, as you just mentioned, kind of about to be, or at least in your discussion or in your third talk, be woven into various phases of the DevOps lifecycle. How would you, or what advice would you give to developers that are watching and or to DevOps teams on kind of just how to do that? And this might just be double clicking into your third talk that you just mentioned. So maybe this is a bit of a teaser. But what advice do you give, and how do you see that as kind of security being the developer's job or job zero for those resources?
Yeah, I mean, it does come sort of full circle, right, with the job zero conversation, because just as security folks cannot afford to be siloed from the dev cycle, developers cannot afford to not care about security anymore.
Right.
That being said, we don't assume that every dev we hire is a security expert. So one of the ways it's easier said than done when we talk about this stuff. On the one hand, the technology enables a lot of tactileness and a lot of pragmatism. Try something and see if it works without a lot of risk. But on the other hand, we also, like I was saying, believe in mechanisms. So one of the things we do is embed a security champion within dev teams. So they are supposed to sort of wear the security hat, because devs generally want to get it out, right? They've got a timeline, they've got a deliverable, they've got a sales cycle and other, goals. And I think that weaving in security, although we all are capable, I truly believe we are all capable of being the security person in the room. Not all of us are tasked with that. And I think there's that healthy texture, right? So one of the ways that we try to democratize that down is by having someone on each team who is kind of wearing the security hat, who ensures that it doesn't just wait until it gets to AppSec. We do still have an AppSec review, but it doesn't wait until it gets to AppSec before you decide, this was not inherently secure, or more interestingly, sometimes it's just that it didn't behave in the same ways that your users would expect from a security standpoint. There's a lot of nuance here, and you want to deliver it for your customers, whomever your customers are. But yeah, I think, this coupling of sort of knowing your boundaries and figuring out when to take a stand, and then but also having a lot of empathy for the other goals that are you as a security person. I think we have very little tolerance anymore for folks who are no people. Right. You gotta figure out a way to get it done. You can say, this doesn't seem right to me, but then we brainstorm on how to make it better. It doesn't end there. And that sounds cliche, but it isn't. That takes work. And so you have to commit to that. Your leadership needs to commit to that. I recommend that folks, escalate this to your leadership and let them know that there will be times that we hold something up. It's going to come at a cost, but you know what? The cost is nothing compared to being on the front lines of the newspaper because we didn't do the right thing. We need to have the wherewithal to influence the business, because ultimately, as I said in the beginning, I really see security as a business differentiator. I see it as a reason why folks, choose to use a certain enterprise or not. And put differently, why enterprises choose to, have a relationship with other enterprises. I think that we are beyond the part of calling it a cost center or an afterthought. We don't bolt it on after the fact. We need to build it in, and we need to just know that is part of growing up, and that's not a criticism, that's an invitation.
No. And, I wholeheartedly agree with you. As a private consumer, if I were to want to do business with somebody and they said, hey, one of our differentiators from our competition is we're a much more secure organization, or we haven't had a breach, or this is how.
Well, I would like to see their data around that, but
right. Well, sure, but
often the folks who talk the most are not. But yeah, no, I think the genuineness of like a genuine security posture that is impressive is a business differentiator. And like, it doesn't matter how unseen it is. It's part of like what is woven into everything you deliver.
Right. And it certainly speaks for itself, for sure. Well, Merritt, thank you, first off. And hopefully this session has been informative to you. Although I kind of feel it a little one way. I've got about a page and a half of notes of things that I need to follow up on. And certainly, I'll be visiting your reInvent talk for certain.
Reinforce.
I'm sorry, reinforce.
I was going to let my pug do a cameo. Hang on, I'm going to grab
it. Of course. So as we're wrapping up and kind of putting a bow around this, any final questions from the group via the comments? Thank you all for those of you who have participated. We've got people from Europe, all over the world looking at your pug right now. So thank you, everyone, and thanks for being a part of this. Merritt, thank you for your time, your information, and certainly we have all the notes and the ways to follow you and get in contact with both of us in the show notes. So thanks again. Hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks, folks. Thanks for tuning in.
Our pleasure. Take care.